Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. Let me say right at the top that there's a lot of news, a lot of important news I'm not going to get to this week because I've decided to go ahead with what's sort of a traditional holiday show around here. This year, being what it's been, I think actually we deserve to step away from it for a moment. This show actually goes on the air for the first time just before Thanksgiving, so it seems it's the right time for me to say, gather around kiddies, I'm going to tell you the actual based on historical accounts version of the first Thanksgiving, by which of course I mean the event that occurred in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts in the fall of 1621, which formed the basis for our now traditional Thanksgiving holiday. One of the reasons I do this pretty much every year is that it's really amazing how much misinformation, mythology, and general muddle-headedness there is out there about this topic. In fact, it seems what could fairly be called revisionist history has become almost as traditional as I don't know, turkey and pumpkin pie. I like to try to bring some hard historical reality to this discussion. So, let's start our Thanksgiving tale and consider this. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit with some 90 men, who for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, bestowed upon our governor and on the captain and others. And though it not be always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. That comes from a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written to an otherwise unidentified, loving and old friend in England by Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and a leader in the early years of the colony. As a sidebar, this picture of Winslow was actually done in 1651, 30 years later, and it was after he returned to England. It is the only verified picture of a Mayflower passenger which is known to exist. As for the rest of them, we actually have absolutely no idea what they look like, except for the traditional description of Miles Standish as being short with red hair. That's a description given some support by the fact that in 1637, a man named Thomas Morton had a book called The New English Canaan, which is a rather nasty satire of the plantation. And in that book, Standish was identified by the name Captain Shrimp. Now, Winslow's letter was contained in a book published in 1622 in England under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginnings and Proceedings of the English Plantations Settled at Plymouth in New England by certain English adventurers, both merchants and others. The book is popularly known today by the rather less cumbersome name Mort's Relation, and it consists of first-hand accounts of events during the first year of the plantation. Now, here's why that Winslow letter is important. It is the only contemporaneous account of what's called the first Thanksgiving, which is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, longtime governor of the settlement, who wrote about it in his journal some 10 or 12 years later. Even there, he just sort of brushes by it, endorsing Winslow by referring to not feigned but true reports. Quoting him, "They now began to gather in the small harvest that they had, and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, of which every family had its portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they first came, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck a meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to that proportion. which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. Okay? That's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is built on. Everything else is speculation, interpretation, some questionable third and fourth hand accounts, and guesswork. Some of that informed, all too much of it not. Now, there are some things we can tell. For one thing, based on other references in those same sources, we know that this event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it took place in late September or the beginning of October, as that would have been shortly after harvest. Now, in considering the event, the first thing to realize is this was not a Thanksgiving, not as we understand the term. To a person of the period, a Thanksgiving was a religious occasion set aside for prayer to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. In Plymouth, the first general public day of Thanksgiving came in the summer in July, in fact, of 1623, a 6 weeks long crop-threatening drought had threatened the crops. So that led to a day of humiliation, a day of fasting and prayer to beg God's forgiveness for whatever they had done for God to call such a thing down on them. Literally, the evening of that same day, the rains came, and not a big storm, but a gentle soaking rain which saved the crops. And so it was felt that a day of Thanksgiving was an appropriate response. So no, this is not a Thanksgiving. Such days would occur occasionally as the need arose, but to plan for one in advance, especially to plan for one every year as we do now, would have been regarded as a gross presumption on God's will and intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional English harvest feast, a celebration of good harvest to which it was traditional to invite those who had been helpful to you over the course of the year, which is likely why the natives are there. They had in fact been helpful, so they were invited. Now, the truth is settlers didn't have a good harvest. Note that Bradford calls it small, but they had a harvest. Which surely was enough to raise everybody's spirits, make people think that, okay, we are going to make it, which was reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they've been through to get to that point, including the deaths by disease, probably pneumonia, of half their company in the first couple of months. And here I want to make a quick aside to explain a rather more subtle point more clearly. Europeans of the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts, such as those that were actually leaders of the Plymouth settlement, they did not make the sort of clear distinctions between what is religious and what is secular that we do today. The sense of, a feeling of, an awareness of the will of God or the hand of God was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest feast would surely have included prayers and thanks to God and perhaps a sermon by the religious leader, Elder William Brewster. These would have been central features of the event, but they would not, prayer would have been a normal feature of their lives. Everything from meals to musket drills to mucking about in their fields with the crops. But prayers would have been significant features of the event. They would not have been the idea, the purpose. They would not have been the driver behind the event. Celebration was, feasting was. Put another way, had we been able to witness the 1621 event, to our modern eyes, there would have been more than enough prayers and giving thanks and singing of psalms and hymns to make it look like a religious or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, it would have looked about as, for lack of a better term, secular as such a thing got. Okay, anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate, it's safe to say they had fowl, such as duck or goose. Note the governor said they set 4 men on fowling in preparation. And yes, probably turkey, of which they took many, Bradford said. They quite likely had fish, especially cod and bass, which are specifically mentioned in the sources, and quite possibly deer. Now, the reason I say quite possibly here is to raise another point. It's to raise the issue of using historical sources without running too far ahead of them, which is a sin of which too many of the revisionist accounts are frequently guilty, the idea of making too much out of too little. Even though Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, he also says, which they bestowed on our governor, that being William Bradford, and upon the captain, that being Miles Standish, and others. In other words, they were given to various leaders of the community, not to the community as a whole. More to the point, we can't tell if those deer were brought soon enough to be butchered, dressed, cooked, and presented as part of the feast, or if they were brought afterwards as a sort of reciprocal gift in return for having been feasted for 3 days. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't resolve things, because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which obviously includes deer, but also obviously is not limited to deer. So while they quite possibly had deer, either from the natives or their own hunting or both, we actually can't say for sure. All right, getting back to the menu, lobster and other shellfish was another high probability. Elsewhere in the letter that I quoted, Winslow says they are plentiful in the area, as are, in fact, eels, of which he says they could take a hogshead in the night. And if you think eels, just realize that an English person of the period would have said, they're just another sort of fish. And by the way, a hogshead is a large cask which holds around 63 gallons of liquid, which means Winslow was probably exaggerating, and he could be like that. All right, beyond that, we can reasonably argue for some other foods, such as a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit, which would have been brought from England, salad from other stuff in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Water would have been the major and possibly the only beverage. Their supply of barley would be limited. Winslow says the English grains, which would mean not only barley but things like wheat and oats and rye, he says they grew indifferent good. There's also no mention of hops. So if there's no hops, there's no beer. And if there's not much barley, you can't even have much ale. Now, even if they did have some barley, there may well not have been enough time to brew before this harvest, before this feast occurred. And they did bring beer with them on the voyage, but it's highly unlikely any of that was still there almost a year later. So while they might have had a little ale or maybe a little wine brought from England and reserved for a special occasion, it was likely mostly and quite possibly only water. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event. Not much to build an entire mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came for the Great Plains, and smiling pilgrims dressed in fashions of the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail is probably a good part of the reason the event provides so much latitude for those who want to replace the childhood and childish images of noble settlers and savage natives with one of savage settlers and noble natives. People who every year, almost as regular as clockwork, treat us the historical revisionism that has again become almost as tradition as cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we were spoon-fed as children, we get fed people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing off with natives, crashing the party at the feast, and doing it in such numbers only because Massasoit feared he'd be captured or killed otherwise. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, is an attempt to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, pure bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between the settlers at Plymouth and their nearest native neighbors were actually reasonably good for several decades. Now, there were stresses and strains and disruptions and problems, of course, along that time, but for the most part, they managed to keep intact the Mutual Defense Pact peace agreement that they made in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse, and I won't get into all the reasons why, but the biggest two were population pressure, which largely arose out of Boston, which was founded in 1630, and disputes over land that were rooted in vast cultural differences between the English and the natives. To be specific, the native culture had no concept of land ownership. Not just that they didn't own the land, or that everyone owned the land, or the Great Spirit owned the land. No, the concept of land as something that could be owned did not exist. To the natives, to possess something meant you could pick it up and carry it away with you. How can you own something if you have to leave it behind anytime you go anywhere? Which makes real sense, especially for a semi-nomadic people who lived in one area part of the year and in another area another part of the year. But for the settlers, for any European, the idea of land ownership, which by its nature includes the concept of exclusive use, was an everyday concept. That cultural chasm caused any number of conflicts. Now, this peace finally, irrevocably, completely broke down. But that was in 1675, 50 years after this event. The fact is, the point here is that at the time, in the fall of 1621, native-settler relations were actually good. In fact, the very next sentences of that Winslow letter I quoted, the very next sentences are these. We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them. Winslow then also says that the other native leaders in the vicinity had made peace with Plymouth on the same terms that they did with Massasoit, as a result of which he asserts there is now great peace amongst the natives themselves, which was not formerly. He then goes on to say, quoting again, we for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us. They are a people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just. Now, just to be certain you know, trust here means trustworthy, not trusting. And quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to understand, quick to grasp the meaning of something. As for religion, in his later book, Good News from New England, published in 1624, Winslow says, therein I erred, and goes on to describe the native religion, at least as he understands it. Now that doesn't sound either like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives or natives who feared contact with these same settlers for fear they'd be kidnapped or killed or felt they had to display massive force when they did. Now, if you're still not convinced, consider that in June 1621, 3 or 4 months before the event, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the town in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation describing the message they sent to Massasoit, quoting, but whereas his people came very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome. Yet we being but strangers yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and desired still to do. That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers, so afraid that the town had to ask them to not come around so much in so many numbers. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either side of trash is trash. Neither of these people were angels, neither were demons. So I reject the revisionist history. Indeed, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it first because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship. And it's everybody's full of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap we got fed as school children. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 genuinely was a scene of peaceful and friendly relations, of good feeling between English settlers and their nearest native neighbors. That first Thanksgiving, so-called, was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were still wary of each other, but everyone on both sides figured, yeah, it looks like this is going to work out. Now, that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. It was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous understanding no more than a few decades. And it was a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty toward and genocide of the native peoples of this continent. It's such that while this first Thanksgiving should not be a source of why can't we all get along happily ever after fairy tales, neither is there any need to co-opt it into the service of an And frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that one moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine some years ago talking about the urge to find angelic forces in the world, the idea that so many of us seem to have, a need to fix on some group, some movement, something that we can convince ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and behavior. In our attempts to find some better balance of our understanding of what was done to the natives of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry which targeted and still targets them, too many of us, in considering the Pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen simply to swap one mythology for perhaps more satisfying but equally false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. So I hope you enjoyed your Turkey Day. I hope you enjoyed it with family or friends, provided, of course, that you could do it safely, that you stayed in your bubble. And I hope you can understand why I celebrate the day as an expression less of thankfulness for the year past or the present than it is an expression of hope for the future. That hope, too, may prove to be as foolish as that of 1621, and in fact, these days I often think it is. But the blunt fact is, hope is the one absolute, indispensable requirement for any effort to make that future a better one. And it's time for a break. And we are back. Okay, I only have a few minutes left. I'm going to spend them expanding on a rant from last time about the efforts of the establishment Democratic Party to use progressives for voter turnout, and then after that, ignore them. Now, just to be clear, the term establishment Democratic Party here refers to the DNC, the party leadership in the House and Senate, and the party's Senate and congressional campaign committees. That's who I'm talking about. Okay, listen up. I said last time the establishment Democratic Party is looking to blame progressives and progressive issues for the party's poor showing down ballot, that is in the House and Senate races, rather than considering their own roles in that. Now that hasn't let up. It wasn't just that one notorious post-election conference call. AP has now joined the fray with an article which could barely get past one tepid criticism of party strategy before rushing on to blame Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and criticisms of police racism and violence. All right, you want to know how unpopular Medicare for All is? According to an exit poll done on November 3rd by, of all people, Fox News, 72% of voters said they would favor a change to a government-run healthcare system. There were 112 co-sponsors of Medicare for All on the ballot in November. All of them won. You want to know how unpopular the Green New Deal is? That same Fox poll found that 70% of voters support increasing government spending on green and renewable energy. There were 98 co-sponsors of the Green New Deal on the ballot. 97 of them won. Bernie Sanders said it well, quoting him, "The lesson is not to abandon popular policies like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, living wage jobs, criminal justice reform, and universal child care, but to enact an agenda that speaks to the economic desperation being felt by the working class, Black, white, Latino, Asian American, and Native American." That is a desperation to which the establishment Democratic Party did not speak in its campaign. Yeah, I know all about the HEROES Act. I know all about the intransigence of Fish-Face McConnell and all the rest. But the establishment Democratic Party figured that the public distaste for Tweety Pie was so great that just playing hardball on COVID economic relief was a politically effective tactic. They were wrong. Okay, and instead of recognizing their failure to make that very GOP intransigence a centerpiece of their campaign, their answer is to blame progressives and to do as much as they can to shut them out of decision-making roles. Which brings me to what really prompted this renewed rant. News is emerging of who Joe Biden wants in his administration, and the trend is not encouraging. Michael McCabe is a former consultant to DuPont who led a successful campaign to head off regulation of a highly toxic chemical called PFOA. He's been appointed by the Biden transition to its review team for the Environmental Protection Agency. Representative Cedric Richmond is joining the administration as a senior advisor and a liaison with the business community and climate change activist. He is a darling of the oil and gas industries, having gotten more money from them than almost any other Democrat. Blodden's nominee for Secretary of State is Anthony Blinken, who supported the invasion of Iraq, supported the assault on Libya, and has spent his recent years as a partner of a consulting firm with a secret client list drawn from the tech, finance, and arms industries. A leading candidate for defense secretary is Michelle Flournoy, Blinken's partner in that consulting firm. Among his other achievements, Flournoy supported the wars in Iraq and Libya, thought Obama wasn't tough enough on Syria, and helped craft the surge in Afghanistan. And those two names, by the way, are very likely why defense executives have been boasting about their close relationship with Blodden and why they expect there really won't be any change at all in Pentagon policy. But perhaps worst of all, it's reported that Blodden is considering Bruce Reed for the Director of Office of Management and Budget. Reed is a deficit hawk who is a lead architect of that destructive 1996 welfare law, and he was executive director of the Obama-appointed Bowles-Simpson Commission, which became known as the Cat Food Commission because its central proposal was to slash Social Security. Appointing someone like that to direct OMB in the midst of an economy-wrecking pandemic is just insane. So far, I am neither encouraged nor impressed. But in closing, I will say there was one thing on which I agree with the critics of the progressives. The slogan, "Defund the Police," has got to be the worst slogan in the history of political campaigning. My central principle for effective communication is that what you say is not as important as what the other person hears. By that standard, defund the police is a miserable, abject failure. Not only does it not express what its supporters intended to, it positively invites people to misunderstand. The idea of defund the police, in a nutshell, is to stop expecting the police to deal with things for which they have neither the training nor the competence, like mental health crises and drug issues and so on, cases where their intervention so often leads to tragedy, and instead direct those resources to agencies and personnel which do have the training and competence. But if people hear defund the police, they think reasonably that you want to zero out police budgets altogether. You just basically want to get rid of police. An effective slogan depends upon a previously widespread understanding. Let me say that clearly. It depends on a widespread understanding of what it means. Defund the police doesn't do that. It's a failure. No, I don't have a devastatingly better alternative, but I will say my preference would be for demilitarize the police, which I think would not only cover what defund the police intends, but actually go beyond it without being so easy to actively misunderstand. All right, I still have like 1 minute left, apparently, so I do have time to get in one of those bits of news that I wanted to cover. According to two opinion polls from mid-November, well over half of all Republicans and a third of all voters believe Tweety Pie rightfully won the election, but it was stolen from him only through widespread voter fraud. The fact is, getting Joe Blodden in the White House is not the end. It does not mean it's over. We have to be prepared for that. Ronald Reagan came into office with less than 51% of the vote and declared a mandate. George Bush came into office with a 530 vote win in one state and losing the popular vote and claimed a mandate. Tweety Pie came into office losing the popular vote by over 3 million and claimed a mandate. It's vital that Joe Blodden comes into office claiming a mandate. Instead, I'm very afraid, he will come into office pledging to make nice with Fish-Face McConnell. That is not going to cut it, but I'm very afraid that that's what's going to happen. And we, as always, are on our own. That's it. I'm done. I will see you in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, stay safe, have the best weeks you can, and peace.